Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Tudors with Leila, the show that aims to bring history back to life. I'm your host, Leila Mahjouby. In today's episode, A Blip in History, The 9 Days Queen, we will discuss the reign of Lady Jane Grey, discussing the ins and outs of her short-lived reign, also known as the 9-Day Queen. Our guest today is Sarah Al-Mahjouby, my sister who has recently graduated from the University of Sussex with a degree in history with Spanish with a passion for everything 1600s, and today we will delve in the world of the 1500s. They're going to share with us the topic of Lady Jane Grey. Hi Sarah, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Leila. I'm really excited to be on the show with you today. For those of us who may not know Lady Jane Grey, definitely not me, could you please share a little bit more about who Lady Jane Grey was?
It'd be my pleasure. The great-granddaughter of King Henry VII and cousin of King Edward VI, whom she'd almost married in 1549, she also had her father-in-law, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, more on him later, who managed to convince Edward to make her the next in line, and 4 days after Edward's death on the 6th of July 1553, she was proclaimed Queen of England. Jane's accession was supported by the royal council, but not necessarily so much the public, who much preferred Mary.
Thanks, Leila. I know that you just mentioned the Duke of Northumberland. Can you tell us in more detail who he was?
In my eyes, and as I think for most, he was the main manipulator for both Edward, the king's protector, and Jane Grey, her father-in-law, for his own interests in the ascension of Jane Grey. The abuse of his position is frankly one of the more despicable actions between the Tudor period, through his clear deceit to fundamentally children. Interestingly, the Duke's father had been executed for treason in Henry VIII's reign. And fun fact, the same day that John's father, Edmund, had been labelled as a traitor, John had been betrayed by the Earls of Pembroke and Arundel by calling a council meeting legitimising Mary's claim to the throne, which was on the 18th of July.
And why do you think that Lady Jane Grey was so heavily disliked before Mary I even became queen?
I think that the answer was quite clear. It came down to that Grey was not a Tudor and Mary was. Even more, Dudley's rotten ancestry tainted the Dudley name. Thus, when Grey had married Guildford, public suspicions of her rose, and, well, to put it nicely, Grey wasn't necessarily welcome with open arms, especially by the English public.
I know that you just went over how Lady Jane Grey was disliked, but how do you think that the portrayal of Lady Jane Grey changed over the years?
I think that the portrayal of Lady Jane Grey is one that, interestingly, has had its turns within history, because pre-Mary, let's say, Lady Jane Grey, people were definitely a lot more distant. Now, this could perhaps be related to, obviously, her new ties to the Dudley family, and of course the legitimacy of her claim to the throne. Well, I say her claim, of course, that's up for debate, but the fact that she wasn't a Tudor, or she wasn't the direct successor as people thought. And so for that reason, public opinion was more on the reserved side, was more confused. There wasn't much about her as well in comparison to Henry VIII's daughter, Mary I. But after Mary's reign, and she had kind of made a name for herself, very obviously by her infamous Bloody Mary, which had been coined, historians say, around John Fox's publication, where he arose to popularity in Elizabeth I's reign. And that's really when the kind of infamous, nefarious title that Mary became known as came to what we know of today, I think. So for obvious reason, kind of Lady Jane Grey became this more martyr in a sense when people became less embracing of the killer queen, and kind of we see kind of Catholicism versus Protestantism divide in this now. And there was actually, I think it's quite a popular um, portrait. Um, so I'm sure that you've seen it, and it actually recently became really popular. But this one portrait of her by, it was Paul, it was some paint some painter.
Is it Paul de
Um,
la Roche that you're referring to?
yes, thank you. Yeah, I was trying to look for that. Paul de la Roche, in the 19th century, in her kind of infamous white dress accusation, no, execution. There we go, execution, which really kind of I think kind of reignited the conversation around her. And of course, her white dress portrayed her as very, very innocent, full of pure, kind of humble narrative of Lady Jane Grey, especially the fact that she was a 17-year-old girl. So that kind of played into people's hearts, I'm sure. And especially because, Jane was this 17-year-old girl. She was young. She had been executed by Mary, who had now certainly painted, or, well, I say her, I think it was certainly other characters of the time, like John Fox and other Protestant figures. But, there had certainly been a devilish kind of, you know, image of Mary, which had already been dominant since around the 17th century. So I think that this painting really started a kind of juxtaposition between the two queens, and it made Jane's almost saintly, and very, very, very opposite of what Mary kind of stood for, in the regard as well of the religious aspect, where she was obviously Protestant. And I think that kind of that did shift people's image. And it was painted during the Romanticism period, so I think that there was already this idea in England of, in the 1800s of England, of being very much an aesthetic, or a more of aestheticized and romanticized version of what we saw in history. So I think that painting really cemented kind of showing Mary and Jane as enemies. And I still think to this day that Mary is looked at very negatively. I mean, for some valid reasons, but I think perhaps some of those claims could be exaggerated. But I think as soon as you pit um, anyone kind of against Mary, as we've seen, I think most notably with Elizabeth, her sister. Um, we have this good Queen Bess, the Virgin Queen, that Elizabeth is known for. So I think as soon as you pit someone against Mary, whether that be Elizabeth or Lady Jane Grey, they already, in the sight of history and in just how history has come to view Mary, I think Jane has had some fair share of, you know, kind of, kind of, um, oh, I don't know what the word is. Kind of,
Like an
um,
unfair portrayal or
the opposite. I think of
a
of
fair portrayal?
a fair portrayal of Jane. And I actually wanted to talk about this painting. I mean, if you can't tell, I really like this painting and what it kind of provides and gives to the picture, because of course we might not have as much on Lady Jane Grey as, you know, Mary Tudor or Elizabeth I. So I think whatever has been put out in history, I am trying to kind of make the most of that. But this painting where she is viewed as kind of a romantic heroine, I interestingly wanted to see in contemporary time, um, the kind of portrayal of Jane now, and more in the less in the historical sense, or not even historical, because I guess it was more to do with religion and kind of a general public opinion. Whereas now, I think that the general public is more focusing less on the religious aspect, as naturally England, as of today, is a less religious, or perhaps more culturally, um more culturally not divided. What's the opposite? I can't find my
United.
united. Yeah, I can't find my synonyms today. Yeah, more culturally united. You know, you've got various religions going on, and of course denominations of Christianity, but certainly more religions as well. But I think in regards to this painting and what this painting portrayed and depicted Lady Jane Grey as, I think nowadays we focus much more on the feminist perhaps side, or the discussion on that. And interestingly, I saw, and why I actually wanted to create this episode on Lady Jane Grey is partly because I think always she's kind of been underrated. And of course, you know, it's natural because it, as the title of this episode says, she was kind of a blip in history. But I think that she is underrated as her own character, as to say. But I think that TikTok's influence, as we all know, has a very kind of strong strong standing in pop culture and the influence on trends. And I saw that, I want to say a few months ago, but it honestly might be a year or a bit ago. This painting was actually trending, and it seemed the cultural kind of trend seemed to take pity on specifically the man's control and abuse over 17-year-old Jane. And it kind of restarted this feminist discussion, I think, and it very much portrayed her as, you know, a girl who was manipulated and abused by a man and used kind of as a chess piece by the men in her life, which I think is certainly part of the discussion. But I think it's interesting how kind of the portrayal of Lady Jane Grey seemingly shifts to what the cultural trend of the time is. You know, when Jane was discussed in the 19th century after the painting was painted, she was portrayed as this romantic martyr, very much in the religious side of the discussion, following what kind of England had been divided on. Whereas now, where feminism is on the rise, you know, we have had waves of feminism. And I think TikTok is very much dominated by Gen Z and kind of new ways of thinking. I think it's interesting how her portrayal kind of seems to shift. Now, I don't know if that's whether perhaps, you know, she is less of a talked about person in the Tudor period, whereas with Elizabeth and Mary, they certainly have their kind of very strict portrayals. Mary as this bloody queen, and Elizabeth as this kind of. She's also sometimes portrayed as a feminist icon, but again, that's, you know, to be debated, I think. But you know, she's a strong female personality, and I think the both of them. But obviously, Elizabeth is more of a positive one, and Mary as more of a negative one. But yeah, I thought that that was quite interesting, how to see how the portrayal of her kind of changes, not necessarily because new information changes public opinion, but more because of the cultural trends of the time.
Thank you so much, Leila. And I think it's really interesting to hear about how the portrayal of Lady Jane Grey has changed over the years, and how to this day she's still an important icon in media. And I mean, we know her as the the 9 Day Queen. Do you think that she should be considered the first Queen of England?
Now, I'm not a historian by any means. I'm not someone who has spent kind of hours and hours and dedicated my life. I myself am a 17-year-old girl as well, but I think that we shouldn't really be debating whether she was a queen or not, but more how throughout history, and I still think currently, she's been emotionally neglected as her own character, as a human, as a person. And I think that yeah, I think that the term queen. Now I don't know the technical term, so I believe she wasn't crowned. She reigned England, but she was never crowned. So I don't know if the technical term she was not. But I again I think it doesn't matter because she has been used as a technical kind of chess piece in history. So I think I'm trying to really stray away from the she is a queen. She like the labels, and perhaps with as much as we do know about her and as much as I know about her, um, more focus on kind of who she was rather than what people pushed her to be.
No, that's great. Well, thank you so much, Leila. It's been really lovely to be on the podcast with you today.
Thank you so much. And I'll just lead on to my conclusion, where I thank you as well for asking such interesting questions, and also to anyone else listening to this podcast who I hope has perhaps also found this intriguing. Now, whether you disagree with any of the points, as long as our discussion has made you think, then I think it's a success, as that's kind of the beauty of history, continuing discussions, seeing how conversations change and embracing new perspectives. Ultimately, I believe that Gray's depiction throughout history has been overshadowed by a male perspective, which ironically would not nor could not identify very closely to that of 17-year-old Jane. So perhaps due to my similar position as Gray, of course, age wise and less so on, the whole Queen of England side, I really do sympathize with her. I intend to focus on her by, well, focusing on her. In my eyes, I don't necessarily view her as this huge feminist icon, nor a martyr, and perhaps most controversially, nor a queen. Rather than focusing on, once again, the technical side of her short time as queen and what that means, I wish to push the conversation into more of her, contemplating how, had it not been for the selfish desire of her father in law, perhaps Jane would have simply gone down in history as a mild addition, to put it, I think, to the best of how I can put it, to the engrossing period that is the Tudors. Of course, I'm about 470 years too late, but I truly think that Lady Jane Grey is a character who would be one of the very first people I would love to know more about, considering the criminally undebated life of her by, more specifically, I think, males, including Paul de la Roche's painting and, of course, the Duke of Northumberland. So I think I'll end it off by, my depiction perhaps of Lady Jane Grey to change the narrative a little bit. I see her not as a feminist icon, not as a martyr, not as a queen, but as a 17-year-old who had been manipulated and had been certainly pushed into this narrative that I think history hasn't given her the grace to see a kind of what if, to see if that's what she really wanted. And yes, I think that concludes the end of this discussion.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Leila. And well, looking forward to the next one.
Thank you. You too.